In 1884, 14 men gathered in Berlin around a giant map of Africa. Over 80% of the African continent was completely sovereign. Within 3 decades, European empires controlled 90% of its landmass. History textbooks claim this rush was driven by national pride and civilizing missions. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The mainstream story is a complete myth. Welcome back to the Sovereign Archive. I am at the auditor. What nobody knew at the time was that European central banks faced systemic collapse. History is not written by political speeches or noble ideas. It is driven by balance sheets, sovereign debt, and raw commodity monopolies. Today, we expose the hidden financial machinery behind the scramble for Africa. The roots of the scramble lie in the financial panic of May 1873. The Vienna Stock Exchange crashed with terrifying speed. Banking houses across Europe collapsed like dominoes. A devastating economic slump hit the entire Western world. Historians call this period the Long Depression. For over 2 decades, European industrial economies suffered from chronic overproduction. Factories produced far more manufactured goods than domestic citizens could afford to buy. Corporate profits plunged across major industrial sectors. Domestic bond yields fell to historic lows. Wealthy European investors held vast reserves of idle capital. They desperately needed new overseas markets offering higher investment returns. At the same time, the international monetary system operated on the rigid gold standard. Nations linked their paper currencies directly to physical gold reserves in central bank vaults. If a nation imported more goods than it exported, physical gold flowed out of its national reserves. A shrinking gold reserve forced central banks to raise interest rates sharply. High interest rates choked domestic businesses and triggered violent mass unemployment. European powers faced a lethal macroeconomic trap. They needed cheap raw materials to lower industrial production costs. They needed captive colonial markets to absorb surplus manufactured goods. Most importantly, they needed new physical gold and mineral deposits to back their expanding monetary supplies. The first major financial domino fell in Egypt. During the 1860s, the American Civil War disrupted global raw cotton supplies. Egypt quickly became the primary cotton supplier for British textile mills. The ruler of Egypt, Khedive Ismail Pasha, borrowed heavily from European merchant banks. European financiers offered predatory loans at exorbitant interest rates. Ismail spent millions modernizing Egyptian national infrastructure. He constructed extensive railway networks, modern deep-water harbors, and the famous Suez Canal. The Suez Canal opened in 1869. It drastically reduced maritime transit times between Europe and Asia. It instantly became the single most strategic financial and maritime trade route on Earth. Then the American Civil War ended. American cotton flooded back onto global markets. Global raw cotton prices crashed instantly. Egyptian state export revenues evaporated overnight. Khedive Ismail faced massive interest payments due to European banking syndicates. He was trapped in an escalating compound debt cycle. To avoid immediate sovereign default, Ismail took out short-term, high-interest emergency loans. European financiers squeezed every drop of financial revenue from the Egyptian treasury. By 1875, the Egyptian state treasury was completely bankrupt. Ismail was forced to put his personal shares in the Suez Canal Company up for sale. Follow the money. The British Prime Minister, Benjamin Disraeli, acted instantly. He needed £4 million in cash to buy the shares. The British Parliament was not in session to approve government funds. Disraeli did not wait for political debates. Instead, he made a secret private deal with Lionel de Rothschild. The Rothschild banking house provided £4 million in cash within 24 hours. Britain secured a 44% controlling stake in the Suez Canal. The most strategic maritime canal on Earth became a British financial asset overnight. This massive asset purchase did not resolve Egypt's underlying sovereign debt crisis. European private investors held tens of millions of pounds in Egyptian government bonds. In 1876, the Egyptian government defaulted on its international debt obligations. Britain and France refused to let their private banking cartels take losses. They forced Khedive Ismail to establish the Caisse de la Dette Publique. This was an international debt management commission controlled by European financial diplomats. European bankers took direct operational control over all Egyptian state tax revenues. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The debt collectors became the government. European officials collected Egyptian agricultural and customs taxes at the source. They prioritized paying European bondholders over funding domestic public services. They taxed Egyptian peasants into extreme poverty. They slashed pay for the Egyptian military. This ruthless financial extraction sparked a violent military revolt in 1881. Egyptian officers led by Colonel Ahmed Urabi rebelled against foreign financial control. The nationalist uprising threatened European financial assets and the Suez Canal. In 1882, British naval forces bombarded Alexandria. British troops invaded Egypt and crushed the nationalist army. Britain occupied the entire country. Official proclamations from London claimed the military intervention was strictly temporary. They claimed it was necessary to restore public order and financial stability. In reality, British military forces remained in Egypt for decades. The entire military invasion was launched to enforce private banking collections. The British military occupation of Egypt sent shockwaves across European capitals. French politicians were furious. France had lost its primary diplomatic and financial leverage over the Suez Canal. French banking houses held vast portfolios of Egyptian state debt. French leaders felt outmaneuvered and financially humiliated. They realized that informal financial influence was no longer sufficient to guarantee corporate profits. To secure economic territory, imperial nations required direct physical control over land. The occupation of Egypt triggered a defensive reaction across Europe. The era of informal commercial trade was over. The era of aggressive colonial annexation began. While Britain and France clashed over North Africa, a new financial operator entered the scene. King Leopold II of Belgium ruled a small European state. His domestic political power was strictly limited by the Belgian constitution. But Leopold was an intensely ambitious private financial speculator. He viewed overseas territory as a pure wealth generator. Leopold understood that small European nations could not compete militarily with large empires. He needed a sophisticated, covert corporate strategy to acquire land. In 1876, Leopold organized a major international geographic conference in Brussels. He invited prominent explorers, scholars, and wealthy philanthropists. He presented himself as a selfless humanitarian. He promised to construct scientific stations across Central Africa. He promised to eradicate the East African slave trade completely. Out of this conference, Leopold created the International African Association. On paper, it was an international humanitarian organization. In reality, it was a private corporate shell company controlled entirely by Leopold. Leopold hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley. Stanley had mapped the uncharted course of the Congo River. Leopold paid Stanley a massive secret retainer funded through corporate proxies. Stanley returned to the Congo Basin with explicit corporate instructions. He was not collecting scientific data. He was acquiring exclusive land rights from local African rulers. Stanley traveled from village to village along the river. He carried hundreds of pre-printed legal contracts written in formal European legalese. Local African chiefs signed these documents by making marks on paper. They believed they were signing peace treaties or commercial trade agreements. In reality, the contracts transferred full political sovereignty and land ownership to Leopold's corporate entity. Chiefs surrendered all rights to local labor, timber, minerals, and waterways. In exchange, they received cheap trade goods like cloth, glass beads, and brass rods. And no, I'm not making that up. Entire sovereign kingdoms were purchased for a handful of mass-produced European trinkets. Stanley secured over 400 signed treaties along the Congo River basin. Stanley set up trading stations along the river corridor. He hired local guides and enforced labor contracts with armed security guards. Leopold renamed his corporate vehicle the International Association of the Congo. He gained absolute private ownership over 2 million square kilometers of territory. This landmass was 80 times larger than the entire Kingdom of Belgium. Leopold owned it as personal private property. It was not a Belgian colony. It was owned by a single corporate shareholder. Leopold's secretive corporate land grab alarmed competing European powers. France quickly dispatched its own explorer, Pierre Sévigné de Brazza. Brazza signed treaties along the northern bank of the Congo River. France established a sovereign claim over what became French Congo. Portugal reactivated ancient colonial claims to the mouth of the Congo River. Portugal formed a diplomatic alliance with Britain to block Belgian corporate control over Atlantic trade routes. European powers were on the verge of open military conflict over African resources. The Chancellor of the German Empire, Otto von Bismarck, stepped in to broker the crisis. Bismarck had previously shown little interest in acquiring overseas colonies. He famously stated that his map of Africa lay in Europe. But Bismarck was a master of realpolitik and industrial diplomacy. German manufacturing was expanding rapidly. German industrial syndicates demanded guaranteed access to raw materials. German merchant firms in West Africa faced increasing commercial restrictions from British and French colonial authorities. Bismarck needed to protect German merchant trade. Bismarck also saw a brilliant geopolitical opportunity. By encouraging French territorial ambitions in Africa, he could divert French attention away from Alsace-Lorraine. France had lost Alsace-Lorraine to Germany in 1871. Bismarck wanted to keep France preoccupied overseas. He partnered with French Prime Minister Jules Ferry to host an international diplomatic conference in Berlin. In November 1884, representatives from 14 sovereign nations convened in Berlin. Not a single African leader or representative was invited to participate. The Berlin West Africa Conference lasted for 3 months. European diplomats sat around a long table featuring a 5-meter-tall map of Africa. Most of the African interior on the map was completely blank. European diplomats filled in those blank spaces using colored pencils and straight rulers. They divided mountain ranges, river basins, and ecosystems among competing European empires. The diplomats established the legal rules for the Scramble for Africa. The most critical outcome was the General Act of the Berlin Conference. Article 35 of the General Act established the principle of effective occupation. Under this rule, a European nation could not simply claim land on a map. To claim valid sovereign ownership, a nation had to establish physical presence on the ground. European powers were legally obligated to notify other signatory nations whenever they claimed new territory. They had to prove that administrative order was fully established. It had to build administrative outposts, fly its national flag, and deploy military forces. Most importantly, it had to enforce commercial monopolies and maintain internal public order. Think about that for a second. The doctrine of effective occupation triggered an aggressive winner-take-all economic race. If a nation did not physically occupy a territory, a rival power could legally annex it. European powers rushed to dispatch armed expeditions into the African interior. Military officers, corporate traders, and diplomatic agents raced to sign treaties before rivals arrived. The Berlin Conference did not bring peace to Africa. It unleashed a ruthless, high-speed land rush across an entire continent. To finance this rapid territorial conquest, European governments turned to privatized corporate charter structures. European treasuries did not want to spend public taxpayer money on colonial administration. Instead, they issued royal charters to massive private monopoly corporations. These chartered companies operated as sovereign financial entities. They were granted exclusive commercial rights to extract local resources in exchange for conquering and administering territory. In West Africa, the British government granted a royal charter to the Royal Niger Company, founded by George Goldie. Goldie deployed armored gunboats along the Niger River. He used military force to clear African merchants out of the river trade. He established strict price controls on palm oil. Industrial factories in Europe needed palm oil to lubricate heavy machinery. African merchants who attempted to trade independently were shelled and destroyed. The Royal Niger Company maintained its own private military force, corporate police, and legal courts. It generated enormous dividend payouts for its British shareholders. In southern Africa, the British tycoon Cecil Rhodes established the British South Africa Company. Rhodes was a ruthless corporate strategist. He gained control of 90% of global diamond production through his company, De Beers. Rhodes used his private chartered company to conquer and annex vast territories in southern Africa. These lands were officially named Rhodesia after him. Rhodes envisioned a continuous British-controlled railway running from Cairo to Cape Town. His corporate ventures were underwritten by major European investment banking houses, including Rothschild and Sons. Karl Peters created the German East Africa Company using similar brutal methods. Peters used armed intimidation to force local African leaders into surrendering land rights. The German imperial government backed his corporate claims with military troops. Across the continent, private financial capital served as the primary instrument of imperial conquest. Global investors bought shares in colonial chartered companies on stock exchanges in London, Paris, Berlin, and Antwerp. The systematic subjugation of an entire continent became a profitable asset class on European balance sheets. The economic machinery of colonial rule demanded constant financial returns. Private shareholders expected high dividend payouts on their colonial stocks. To deliver these profits, chartered companies and colonial administrations implemented extreme systems of resource extraction. The human and social consequences were immediate and catastrophic. In the Congo Free State, King Leopold faced severe financial troubles during the late 1880s. He had exhausted his personal fortune constructing military outposts and purchasing steamships. His private colony was losing money daily. Leopold faced personal bankruptcy. Then, two industrial innovations saved his balance sheet. John Boyd Dunlop patented the pneumatic rubber tire in 1888. Simultaneously, a global bicycle craze and the early automobile industry swept across Western nations. Global demand for raw rubber skyrocketed overnight. The dense tropical rainforests of the Congo contained vast natural reserves of rubber vines. Leopold converted his private domain into a massive industrial extraction factory. He divided the Congo into commercial concession zones and leased them to private companies. Companies like the Abir Congo Company and the Société Anversoise were granted total monopolies over rubber harvesting. Leopold held 50% of the stock in these corporate concession entities. The shares were publicly traded on the Antwerp Stock Exchange. As global rubber prices soared, the valuation of Leopold's shares skyrocketed. Private investors realized astronomical profits. But the physical extraction process depended on systematic terror. Leopold's private military force, the Force Publique, enforced strict monthly rubber quotas on African villages. Villagers were forced to trek deep into dangerous jungles to collect wild rubber latex. If a village failed to meet its assigned quota, soldiers took women and children hostage. Male workers were beaten with hippopotamus hide whips, mutilated or shot. Entire villages were burned down. Millions of Congolese people perished from exhaustion, starvation, massacres, and introduced diseases. Here's the thing most people don't realize. The Belgian public did not own or govern the Congo Free State. Belgian taxpayers received zero public tax revenue from its operations. The immense wealth extracted from Congolese rubber flowed directly into King Leopold's private bank accounts. Leopold used these profits to construct extravagant public monuments, grand avenues, and palaces in Brussels and Ostend. He purchased luxurious estates on the French Riviera. The grand architectural legacy of modern Brussels was funded directly by forced labor in the Congo. Now, look at how this economic machinery operated across the entire continent. Exactly at the equator of this global land grab, the true corporate nature of world politics becomes undeniable. I am at the auditor speaking to you from deep within the Sovereign Archive. If you appreciate these deep financial breakdowns, subscribe to the channel right now. Your support keeps these deep historical investigations alive. Beyond rubber, European powers restructured African agricultural systems toward single-crop export production. In West and East Africa, colonial authorities forced local farming communities into monocrop farming. Entire national economies were reorganized around single export commodities. Senegal was forced to cultivate peanuts exclusively. Ghana was converted into a cocoa plantation. The Gambia produced groundnuts. Uganda was ordered to cultivate raw cotton. Local farmers were prohibited from growing traditional food crops for domestic consumption. They were forced to devote their most fertile land to growing export cash crops. This systemic shift created severe long-term economic vulnerabilities. African societies became totally dependent on volatile commodity prices set on European stock exchanges. If the price of cocoa or cotton dropped in London, entire populations faced immediate economic ruin and famine. To force African populations into the colonial labor market, European administrations designed targeted tax mechanisms. African subsistence farmers had no internal need for European paper currency. They grew their own food, built their own housing, and traded through local barter networks. They refused to work in dangerous European mines and plantations for minimal wages. To solve this labor shortage, colonial governments enacted mandatory cash taxation laws. They introduced the hut tax and the head tax. Every adult African was legally required to pay an annual tax in European fiat currency. If a farmer failed to pay the tax in cash, colonial authorities burned his home or forced him into penal labor camps. The only legal way an African farmer could obtain European paper currency was by selling his labor to European mines, plantations, or chartered corporations. Pay attention to this next detail because it explains everything. The taxation system was not created to collect public revenue for infrastructure. It was engineered to dismantle self-sufficient traditional economies. It legally forced millions of African peasants off their land and into low-wage industrial labor pools. The tax laws converted independent agrarian communities into dependent wage laborers overnight. The artificial borders drawn during the Berlin Conference reinforced this systematic economic extraction. European diplomats drew arbitrary lines across maps without regard for local geography, culture, or historical trade routes. They divided long-standing kingdoms in half. The Somali people were fragmented across 5 separate administrative zones: British, Italian, French, Ethiopian, and Kenyan. The Hausa nation was divided between French Niger and British Nigeria. The U community was split between British Gold Coast and German Togoland. Conversely, European pencil lines forced historically distinct ethnic groups into artificial administrative units. In Nigeria, the British merged over 200 distinct linguistic groups under one colonial government. In Rwanda and Burundi, Belgian administrators magnified social divisions between Hutu and Tutsi populations. They issued mandatory ethnic identity cards and utilized minority rule to maintain administrative control. These borders were not created to build viable sovereign nations. They were designed as administrative conduits for resource extraction. The borders linked interior mining and agricultural sites directly to coastal export ports. Rail lines were built exclusively to haul raw minerals and cash crops out of the country, rather than connecting internal regional markets. Inter-African commercial trade networks were effectively dismantled. The pursuit of African mineral wealth triggered major military battles between imperial powers. In southern Africa, the discovery of massive gold reserves in the Witwatersrand region in 1886 altered the global financial balance. The gold fields were located inside the independent Boer Republic of the Transvaal. British financial syndicates, led by Cecil Rhodes and mining capitalist Alfred Beit, sought full ownership of Transvaal gold mines. Gold was the ultimate anchor of the international monetary system. Under the gold standard, control over physical gold supply dictated global credit expansion. The British Empire could not tolerate an independent government controlling the world's largest gold deposit. This economic friction led directly to the Second Boer War in 1899. Britain deployed 400,000 troops to conquer the Boer republics. Britain spent over £200 million funding the Boer War. To achieve military victory, British forces constructed a vast network of concentration camps. Tens of thousands of women, children, and African laborers died from starvation and disease inside these camps. Britain won the war and annexed the gold fields. The financial elite in London secured direct control over global gold production, solidifying the dominance of the British pound. Another dangerous confrontation occurred at Fashoda in 1898. British forces moving south from Egypt encountered French military forces advancing east from West Africa at a remote fort on the Nile River. Both nations claimed strategic ownership over the region. The Fashoda incident brought Britain and France to the edge of open war. The crisis was resolved through high-level diplomatic and banking negotiations in London and Paris. By 1914, the scramble for Africa was complete. European empires controlled 30 million square kilometers of land. European military officers mapped the new borders using military surveying equipment. They established customs posts along newly drawn regional boundaries to tax local trade. Only two African nations remained nominally independent: Ethiopia, which repelled an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia, backed by the United States. The remainder of the continent was administered directly from European capitals. When African nations gained political independence during the mid-20th century, they inherited these colonial frameworks intact. Emerging African leaders assumed governance within the exact straight-line borders drawn in Berlin in 1884. They inherited economic systems structured entirely for raw resource export rather than domestic industrial integration. Follow the money. The core mechanics of financial control did not vanish when colonial governments withdrew. They shifted into modern international monetary and banking agreements. A clear example is the CFA franc currency system in West and Central Africa. Established by France in 1945, the CFA franc served as the national currency for 14 African states. Under CFA franc regulations, participating African nations were required to deposit up to 85% of their foreign exchange reserves into the French treasury in Paris. The currency was pegged directly to the French franc and later to the euro. France held veto power on the central bank boards of these African nations. This monetary structure provided France with continuous control over credit creation and capital flows in its former colonies. It guaranteed French corporations preferential access to strategic mineral reserves and domestic commercial contracts. While these nations possessed political independence, their national monetary policies remained linked to financial authorities in Paris. Recent monetary reforms have modified these arrangements, but deep structural dependencies remain. Sovereign debt became another major tool of modern financial influence. Following independence, African governments borrowed capital from Western private banks, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. These loans were collateralized by future revenues from primary commodity exports such as crude oil, copper, and agricultural products. During the late 1970s and 1980s, global interest rates rose rapidly while raw commodity prices crashed. African states faced crippling debt servicing costs, creating a crisis similar to the Egyptian financial default of 1876. To receive loan restructuring, African governments were required to implement structural adjustment programs mandated by international financial organizations. These adjustment programs required African states to sell national utilities, eliminate domestic agricultural subsidies, reduce health and education funding, and open domestic markets to foreign corporate ownership. National tax revenues were directed towards servicing foreign debt obligations rather than building domestic infrastructure or industrial capacity. Today, in 2026, a new global competition for African resources is actively underway. The primary drivers are no longer rubber or Victorian gold. The current competition centers on critical strategic minerals required for global technology sectors and energy infrastructure. Africa holds over 70% of global cobalt reserves, essential for energy storage technologies. It possesses vast deposits of lithium, manganese, platinum, copper, and rare earth metals. Strategic infrastructure projects like the Lobito Corridor rail network connect Katanga copper and cobalt deposits directly to Atlantic ports for international shipping. Global economic powers and commercial syndicates are competing to secure long-term rights to these critical mineral deposits. China has invested hundreds of billions of dollars across Africa through infrastructure development initiatives. Chinese state-backed banks have funded rail networks, deep water ports, and energy installations in exchange for long-term mineral offtake agreements and equity stakes in national assets. Concurrently, Western corporations and institutional investment funds are deploying capital to secure strategic supply chains. Sovereign debt structures remain a central mechanism of influence. Multiple African states manage high sovereign debt obligations, with national bonds traded on international exchanges in London and New York. Global credit rating agencies influence national borrowing costs and international capital access. The artificial boundaries drawn in Berlin in 1884 continue to impact modern geopolitical dynamics. Borders cutting through traditional communities have contributed to territorial disputes and internal instability. Regional conflicts across Central Africa, the Sahel, and the Horn of Africa reflect structural issues rooted in colonial border design and resource allocation. The physical layout of African transport infrastructure continues to reflect colonial extraction patterns. Rail and road corridors frequently connect interior mining sites directly to coastal shipping terminals, rather than facilitating trade between neighboring African states. Intra-African commercial trade remains significantly lower than intra-regional trade in Europe or Asia. The straight lines drawn on maps in 1884 remain persistent structural factors in global trade. The scramble for Africa was not driven by diplomatic altruism or ideological missions. It was a rapid, coordinated financial intervention driven by European stock market crashes, bond defaults, corporate profit requirements, and monetary gold shortages. The lines drawn by diplomats sitting in Berlin set the economic architecture that continues to influence global financial flows, resource access, and international geopolitics. As the auditor closes his archive folio and dims the banker's lamp, the arbitrary lines drawn in 1884 still dictate modern resource power. Leave in the comments if you followed the money, subscribe now, and click the next video on screen to decode more hidden financial history.